Last week I came out with a summary for policymakers of the synthesis report of the IPCC 6th assessment report. Today I'm talking to Dr. Gregory Flato, and he's one of the people who wrote the report. Dr. Flato has been a research scientist at Canadian Centre for Climate Modeling and Analysis since 1993, and its manager from 2004 to 2014. His expertise is in the area of sea ice and global Earth system modeling. He is a professor at the University of Victoria. In 2016, Dr. Flato received the Deputy Minister's Commendation Award for his important contributions in climate science and research in Canada. Dr. Flato, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's my pleasure.
So, the planet is warming. It's our fault. It's going to get worse before it's going to get better. But we can still save a lot if we act now, today, before it's too late. Is that a correct, very short summary of the report?
That is exactly a correct and very accurate summary of the report.
Thank you. All models keep us to 1.5 Celsius have global emissions peaking before 2025. That's in 21 months. Why do you think people are not listening?
I think that a couple of things are important to note. That first of all, that having emissions peak very soon and then start to decline is necessary if we want to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees. That's a very ambitious target that was set by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, I think the difficulty is that for everyone, for individuals and for governments, it's hard to make the big changes that are required to get our emission to stop growing and to start declining and to ultimately get to zero, because emissions from fossil fuel combustion are such a big part of our modern life. It's required in automobiles that we drive around in trucks and ships that move our supplies around, that move our food and everything that we buy around. In many places, it's part of the electricity generation that powers our homes and heats our homes. So it is a really tough challenge to reduce those emissions. And I think that's why it's been hard to get real action on that. There has been progress, but not nearly at the speed that we need.
Yeah. At this point, we're not going to be able to stop it from going over 1.5.
That's pretty much the case. Yeah, at this point, we're on a path that will lead us to above 1.5 degrees. As you noted, the IPCC assessment is that emissions have to peak very soon, either now or by 2030, and then decline rapidly and reach net zero by about 2050 if we're to achieve 1.5 degrees. But the important thing is that even if we exceed 1.5 degrees, there are still pathways that will get us back below 1.5 degrees before the end of the century, or pathways that will allow us to stabilize at temperatures even a little bit above 1.5 degrees. The important thing is that every little bit matters. Every little bit of emission reduction we can make now is important. And as low as we can stabilize temperature, the lower the better.
Yeah. The International Energy Agency has said no new fossil fuel projects are compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius. And Canada seems to come out with a big new project every year, like Cedar LNG, already in 2023. Canada said no more new fossil fuel subsidies, and then last year they gave 20 billion. Why is this happening, and is there any end in sight for Canada?
Well, these are policy issues and not science issues. So for me, it's a bit hard to comment on, because what I have expertise in and what my job is to look at the science of climate change and understand how the climate is changing and why it's changing, and to provide information that will allow policymakers to make good choices about emission reductions. Now, we do have an emission reduction policy in Canada. That is now the law. We do have an ambition to reach net zero before 2050. So we have policies in place, and I think that we're on track to start turning the corner for that. But as you say, we're not there yet, and a lot more ambition needs to be had before we get there.
Yeah. Having done all this work on more than one IPCC report, how do you feel about our chances?
Well, I'm an optimist. I always think that there's things that can happen. There's progress that can be made. Even if it doesn't look like it right now, there is a lot of action going on that points in the right direction. And, I look at how rapidly electric vehicles, for example, are being built and purchased by consumers. I see how much progress there is on renewable energy, solar and wind power. So I think there's lots of positive signs, and the technology is available to substantially reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. So I think there's lots of reason for optimism that we will eventually get emissions down to net zero and begin to stabilize it.
Yeah. What changes are we going to see that are now unavoidable?
Well, the changes that we're seeing, especially in Canada, the things that we already see are a shortening of the winter season. That is the time over which there's snow on the ground. That's getting shorter and shorter. The amount of snow that we accumulate in the winter is getting less. The amount of sea ice in the Arctic is declining, and we see that every summer. On average, we get less and less sea ice, and it's not as thick as it used to be. So there are a number of things that we see that are changing. We also see the increase in some kinds of extreme events, like extreme precipitation events that cause flooding. So we're seeing lots of changes that are already occurring. And the important thing is to stabilize warming so that those don't get even worse than they already are, or that we limit the extent to which they get even worse. Right now, we have the ability to adapt to a lot of these changes, but if we let the changes get too large, we won't be able to adapt to some of them.
Yeah. What we do in the next 7 years will impact us for thousands of years. What degree of warming are we headed towards right now?
Well, as we talked about at the beginning, right now, the global emission reductions that are either in place or are part of policies that have been announced still leave emissions exceeding the values that would limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So it's very hard to see right now how we would get to a 1.5 degree world. We're going to go past that. It's almost inevitable. But the extent to which we go above 1.5 degrees is determined by choices that we make from now and over the next few years. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of the importance of making choices that lead to lower emissions, to a lower carbon footprint in their lives and in their businesses. So I think the awareness is growing, and I think people are starting to make those changes. And as I mentioned, things like electric cars, a lot of people are starting to move towards that. A lot of cities are starting to put infrastructure in place that would allow electric cars to be used conveniently. So I think there's a lot of promising signs there.
Yeah. Getting 195 countries to agree is hard. Are there things that were cut that you think should have been there?
There was really nothing in the synthesis report. There was nothing that was cut that was an important aspect of the report. It was a very hard approval plenary. It took a very long time. As you say, getting a whole bunch of representatives from a whole bunch of governments to all agree on things is hard. So the wording was changed in a lot of places. That in some cases was to help clarify what was meant, to make the language easier to understand by policymakers. But there was nothing that I can think of that was a substantial cut that was made to the document.
What do you wish more people knew about the report and climate change in general?
Well, the two things I wish people would understand more profoundly is, first of all, that the climate change we are experiencing is due to primarily the emission of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion. That's the core issue. But the second thing is that there are things we can do to reduce those emissions, and there are pathways that lead us to a low emission or net zero emission future. And so it's not hopeless. There are ways that we can get there. It just requires collective effort and collective motivation to employ those changes that we have to make to be more energy efficient, to have energy that is produced from non-emitting activities, and for those emissions that we can't avoid or can't stop, to have other technologies to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and store it in a permanent way. So there's technologies for that. There are ways that we can do that. It's mostly a question of getting everybody to be proactive about changing their activities and their lifestyles in a way that will lead to a lower emission outcome.
Yeah. Dr. Flato, thank you for all the work that you are doing to help save us and for taking the time to talk to me today. And remember, together kids can save the world. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you very much.